The example I was trying to think of examples where we know that something has a certain origin and we've successfully detached the origin from the thing. And it sounds lame, but the example that I thought most accurately reflects would either be money or desktops on a computer. I'll go with desktops. When computers were created, people were used to physical spaces. So in order to signal that this is your workspace on the computer, we called it your desktop because we wanted to get people used to saying, oh, just like I work on my physical desktop, I work on my virtual desktop. Kids today have no idea what it is to work on a physical desktop, but they still call that thing that opens up on their computer a desktop. So the word desktop has completely detached its meaning right from that previous thing, the physical desktop. But no one seems to care. Like, whereas the skeptical position would be like, well, we know it's not a physical desktop, therefore we should call it something different. And I think the social constructivists would be like, no, we can just detach the meaning. So why can't we do that with something like race? Why can't we wash the funk off of that word, so to speak?
If we could, I would argue that we would have already. If we are still finding ourselves in 2021 with people having to use the refrain of, I'm human too, I am a person, I am a human being, I matter, my life matters, my family's lives matter. If we are still saying that refrain, that reminds me inevitably and interconnectedly with the refrain of abolitionism when slavery was a thing in American society, then that should signal to us the sort of impossibility of separating the thing. How many more centuries are we going to put into a Reconstructionist effort based off of that type of logic, or I would say illogic? If we've already spent centuries trying to do that thing, trying to remove and disconnect the sort of origins, and we haven't been successful. We've made progress, certainly. I think that's indisputable, but we haven't been able to successfully do it in a way that lessens or eliminates systemic racism. Then I would argue that that effort is a misdirected and misguided effort, and that
Yeah.
perhaps we should explore alternative ways of both seeing race and also alternative ways for imagining our futures. And we don't have to look too far, because if we look outside of the American context and we look at how race and racism operate elsewhere, that also should indicate to us that it's possible for race and racism to be a sort of non-factor, to be less violent. And while human societies have hierarchies across the board, we have hierarchies outside of racism, we have hierarchies in other spaces where it might not be racism, it might be a sort of ethnic hierarchy. Hierarchies exist everywhere. And they would still exist without the persistence of racism, but that's also not a reason not to completely dismantle and destroy that thing called racism. And one other thing I wanted to say before I forget, and before we get too far from Kendi's quote. In that quote, he talks about the sort of fallacy of a post-racial aspiration, if you will. And in Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality in American Life, Barbara and Karen Fields talk about how the idea of post-racial or post-race is also the idea of post-racist, because the argument that race still exists and matters is often linked to the persistence and presence of racism, which again is evidence that race and racism are the same thing. If to be a post-racial society, we have to be post-racist. That's Kendi is proving my point. He's giving us evidence to how they are the same thing. And again, one can operate as a constructionist and still push for eliminativism. But
Right.
operating as a constructionist and pushing only for reconstructionism, I feel like that's where it becomes a problem, because in upholding the category and arguing for its continuation, we are also unintentionally reifying the same thing that we're seeking to destroy, which is racism. And that's the biggest problem with Kendi's argument in that moment, at least for me.
Right. I mean, one of the difficulties I have with Kendi, probably a similar difficulty to what you have with Kendi, is that he seems to want two things. Ultimately, his end goal is very clearly a race abolitionism. He says it very explicitly, like, I want a world where to say that someone is black or white would be this as trivial as saying that someone has 1,000 hairs on their head versus 50. Like, it doesn't tell you anything. That's the world he wants. But his way of getting there seems odd, which is that we need to actually, because racism has inflicted so much damage, we need to strengthen the concept of race because that's the only way we can alleviate those inequalities. But then as soon as we do, race will cease to mean anything because we don't have racism anymore. So to your point, if you don't have racism anymore, you don't have race anymore. And I'm just so skeptical that if you strengthen the power of that idea, that you'll ever just be able to trust it to just kind of like just disappear. After we strengthen it, it'll disappear.
It's
I'm
illogical.
skeptical.
It doesn't make sense. And our evidence is looking at what's happening in society with the argument and debate about CRT. And even what has happened historically before CRT became a sort of headline for every media news outlet. There is a lot of fodder that exists in society today that indicates to us this promotion and privileging and elevation and upholding of race is actually having unintended effects. And instead of just dismissing the sort of anti-CRT debates outright because we disagree, I think that we would do better to actually listen to what's at the core of what a lot of people are saying in a sort of in the position against teaching this thing in secondary school and primary schools. If ultimately to get more of what we want, more of what society wants, there is an alternative way that hasn't been explored yet in American society. We haven't explored this way of eliminativism or skepticism. We've only ever done a sort of constructionist or naturalist and reconstructionist practices. So what's holding us back? What do we have to lose in going about it a different way?
And that's a good question for people to ask, like, honestly, not just rhetorically. What do we have to lose? I would like to hear